This is going to be part 2 of Industrial North, Factories in the North, lesson 2, after chapter 15. And what I want you to follow along is with your worksheet and make sure you have the correct answers and make any corrections if you need be. But America is changing at this time. It started out with working conditions and factories that Francis Cabot Lowell developed, and then we're going to see how factories are starting to dramatically change. The regional specializations, of course, the northeast is industrial. The west is the nation's breadbasket. That's where they're growing grain and other types of crops and ranching. The south is your cotton and slavery and tobacco. So which region remained rural and which area became urban? Rural means they stayed like this, living in the country, mainly farming. Urbanized are larger cities where all your factories are. This is the region where the north is going to be mainly. So the southerners and westerners are your rural regions of the United States, and the northern region will become a place of major cities, major shipping industries, major factory industries. Factories produced items such as shoes, to watches, to guns, sewing machines, agricultural machinery, in addition to textiles and clothing. Again, your first factories, your mills, were your textiles and clothing. But as more processing styles developed, including the processing of creating steel and other types of metals and mass production, it's called the Bessemer process. Other new machines, guns, other items will be produced at a large scale. The working conditions worsened as factories grew, however. Employees worked an average of 11.4 hours a day, often under dangerous and unpleasant conditions. This also meant that they didn't have bathroom breaks. Their lunch break usually was 15 to 20 minutes long. And if they were away from their machine for too long, they could face the wrath of the boss man. Also, there were no sick days. You couldn't call in sick because you have a sick child or you were personally sick. You worked 6 days a week, and Sunday was the only day you had off. There was no vacation time in those days, so you couldn't look forward to a 2-week period off or anything like that. In the summer, factories were hot and stifling, and in the winter, there was no heat. Remember, there's no air conditioning at this time, refrigeration system, so you had to rely on open windows in the factories, and usually the open windows were along the ceiling and on the sides of the walls. And you had these big, huge bay doors, but that was about it. Ventilation was terrible, so the more steam you used or the more smoke that you had around your area, the more you breathed in. Some factories cleaned cotton and other fabrics. You would inhale that cotton into your lungs, and it would cause you to have like lung cancer and other types of diseases. Children were used as cheap labor, working for dangerous hard work 6 days a week, 12 or more hours a day, just like the parents. A lot of times the parents needed their child to work, number one, to keep them out of trouble, number two, because they needed the income. This is extremely apparent, especially in those northeastern places like New York and Boston, where you had those types of factories. Remember, public school was still just for a certain class of people. And if you could afford to allow your kid to go to school, it would be great. But usually the ones that hurt the worst are the really poor class. No laws existed to regulate working conditions or to protect the workers early on. So as you can see in this picture, a typical work day, at what time did a worker end its work? 8 o'clock is when they finished, and they would start as early as 7 a.m. in the morning. You had a breakfast break at 9. That meant you did not eat breakfast before you got to work. You had a lunch break at 1, and you had about an hour off because you worked until 8 o'clock at night. As you can see here, these kids are sleeping outside of their job. It might be their lunch break time. Maybe they couldn't afford for them to have lunch. But they're standing above this grate right here. And this grate was part of a steam system to heat the building and heat the machines for the factory machines. And they're actually sitting as close to it as they can so they can get warm while they're taking a nap. Here's some smaller children working on a power loom as the factory is being made. They're actually in charge of the thread systems, so they're spooling the threads, and she's watching the threads as they go. So there was no child labor laws at this time. So workers attempted to organize. As early as the 1830s, workers began to organize to improve working conditions. Trade unions, is what they're known as, are unions today, organized workers with the same trade or skill they would develop. Unskilled workers also organized due to poor working conditions. Skilled workers in New York City went on strike or refused to work in the mid-1830s. Going on strike means everybody walks off the job at once and no one will go back to work, and you refuse to work. If you organize and unite all at once, it basically makes the owner of the company powerless, and you can unite to get better working conditions and better pay. They hoped for higher wages and a 10-hour worked day at this time in the 1830s. Although the North did not have slavery in the 1830s, it did have racial prejudice and discrimination. Many northern towns passed voting laws against African Americans. Free African Americans were not allowed to attend public schools or were barred from public facilities. They were forced into segregated schools and hospitals in most communities, or if there was not a segregated hospital or school, they just had to do without. Few African Americans were successful in business, and most, though, were extremely poor. Women in the workforce, they were discriminated against in the mills and factories, even though they played a major role in the development of the industry. Think about the Lowell Mills women in the early 1790s and the 1800s with Francis Cabot Lowell. They worked for less pay, about half as much as the men. They were excluded from unions. Even the unions themselves with the men did not allow the women to join in their fight. They were kept out of the workplace to make more jobs for men later on. So if you had a widow with children, a widow is somebody whose husband had died, it was very hard for her to find a job that paid enough so that she can take care of her kids. The Lowell Female Labor Reform Organization in Massachusetts petitioned the state legislature for a 10-hour workday in 1845. As you can see here, guys, 10 hours. And this is for 6 days a week, not like we think of today where they're protected. If you work a 10-hour day, you're only supposed to work 3 to 4 days a week. That's like nursing today. The legislature did not even consider the petition signed by the women. So women and African Americans were discriminated against. Let's talk about the growth of cities. People moved to the cities to fill the factory jobs. In the 1860s, the population in New York City was over 800,000. And you can see what Philadelphia had. Some major cities developed between 1820 and 1840 from Midwestern villages located along rivers. City life was often difficult and dangerous due to overcrowding, the rundown buildings, no sewer systems, which led to the threat of disease. One of the biggest reasons why people move to America is for jobs. And if you really think about it, think about the era of exploration and colonization where they came for religious freedom. They came maybe because their country was at war with another country and they were basically forced out because their homes were destroyed, no family left. A lot of them came for adventure because they heard about America's prosperity and how you could really own your own land in America. Some European countries wouldn't allow you to own your own land. So there's a lot of reasons why people moved here. Ireland and Germany we had the largest immigrant groups between 1820 and 1860. They were two largest. And if you're paying attention, I already answered number 5 for you about people coming for jobs. People were coming because of political reasons or religious freedom. And there was just nothing left for them in their countries. But the two immigrant groups are the Irish and the Germans. The Irish came because let me go ahead and get down to that page. The Irish and the German immigrants came between this time period, and the Irish came because of a famine in Ireland. A famine means a starvation. mainly potato famine. Their potato famine, there was a blight or a fungus that was developed in the ground. That takes decades to get rid of. So between the 1830s and 1860s, over 30% of America's immigrants came from Ireland. The Irish immigrants mainly settled in the north and worked in the factories because they had no money. They were a part of England at that time, and England mainly controlled the land, so these people had no way to sell their land. And nobody would buy it anyway because of the blight. The Germans, on the other hand, were different. These Germans settled in the southern part and the Midwest. These Germans who immigrated were mainly because of all of the wars happening in the Germanic region, and they were politically pushed out of their countries. They had money. They were your store owners. They were your craftsmen, so they could come over to America with their trade, and many of them opened up their own stores or bought their own farms. And that's different. As you can see here, this is not a very nice image of an Irishman, as you can see from this face. So the Irish were actually not really loved in America when they were coming, mainly for two reasons. Number one, it seemed like that they were stealing jobs away from Americans because they were willing to work for less pay. And number two, many of these Irish are Catholic, and most Americans were Protestant, and so it was very different from what Americans were used to, and it caused a lot of complications. As a result of so many immigrants, especially those Catholic Irish that were moving into the industrial north, a new political party will actually gain power, and they will actually elect one president to office. This was known as the Know Nothing Party. The reason why we don't even know the name of the original party is because every time you asked somebody in this political party what their name of the organization was, they would say, "We know nothing." Another thing is, they were very anti-immigrant. They only wanted jobs for Americans, not jobs for immigrants. So if you asked them how they felt about immigrants, they would answer, "We know nothing." If you asked them how they felt about Catholics as immigrants, they would say, "I know nothing." So that's why they were given the name Know Nothing Party. They were very pro-American, very anti-immigrant, especially Catholic immigrants. I'm not sure if they were anti-Jewish, but they do want to protect American jobs. They saw all of these immigrants here as stealing American jobs, and possibly there was a fear that too many Catholics coming at one time would actually threaten America's Protestant Catholic religion. So America was changing between 1820 and 1860 because of all of these innovations in factories, the innovation in transportation from steamboat travel to railroad travel. So as you can see, between 1820 and 1860, the drop in agriculture or farming. We had increase in mining for iron ore and for coal, an increase in construction because of all of the major cities that were developing. Manufacturing industry was increasing too because of factories. Trade was increasing. Transportation is increasing. The service industry means like hotels and restaurants, that is also increasing at this time. So there's a lot of opportunities. So there's a lot of negative, but there's also some positive when it comes to the industrial age of the northeastern part of our nation.